Millionaire witnesses his black daughter humiliated in his store, and his response sparks outrage. A light rain fell over the city as Renato stepped out of the car, in front of the imposing facade of the store. His dark suit, too simple for someone of his wealth, didn't draw attention, and he liked that. He glanced to the side, where Isabella adjusted the hood of her red jacket. The girl's brown eyes sparkled with curiosity as she observed the gleaming displays, filled with elegantly dressed mannequins. "Dad, this place is beautiful, right?" she remarked, her voice sweet and excited. Renato smiled slightly, giving her shoulder a gentle pat. "Very beautiful. Shall we go in?" "Nah, I'm in." Though it was a perfect reflection of what he had built, luxury, elegance, and exclusivity. However, Renato always found that environment oppressive, almost cold, despite having invested millions into its creation. As he entered with Isabella, the staff cast quick glances but averted their eyes once they deemed them just ordinary customers. "Nyanchant. Look at this dress, Dad. It looks like a cloud," Isabella whispered, pointing to a delicate piece with her eyes shining in admiration. Renato let out a muffled laugh. She always found beauty in the little details, even in a place that seemed designed just to impress. The girl wandered through the aisles, lightly touching the fine fabrics, until a firm, annoyed voice interrupted the silence. "Excuse me, young lady." Renato froze in the middle of the aisle, his muscles tensed. He turned slowly to see a tall employee, with a sharp face and a stern expression, blocking Isabella's path. "This section isn't for you. Leave before I call security." Isabella widened her eyes, confused and unsure of how to react. I'm waiting for my dad. He's here." "None, he's here." The man crossed his arms, impatient. "Your dad?" "Girl, this isn't a place for games. If you don't leave now, I'll have to take action." "Now, Renato's blood boiled, but he held back. He watched the scene with his heart racing, each word from the employee cutting like a blade. Isabella glanced around, searching for Renato, her eyes already brimming with tears. "I didn't do anything wrong," she murmured softly. The employee stepped closer, his voice cold and firm. "That doesn't matter. Customers like you aren't welcome here." "Me." Renato clenched his fists inside his jacket pockets, feeling rage rise like an uncontrollable fire. His daughter was being treated like an intruder, like someone who didn't belong there, someone unworthy. In that moment, he could have revealed himself, could have humiliated that man in front of everyone, but he didn't. Instead, he just watched. Isabella's gaze now fixed on the floor, her small body curled in shame and fear. The employee, satisfied with her submission, nodded dismissively, as if waving away an unpleasant task. "Go on, girl. You heard what I said." Renato took a deep breath, feeling each second weigh heavily on his chest. Why wasn't he intervening? Why did he allow this to continue? When he finally stepped forward, Isabella saw him and ran to him, grabbing his arm. "Dad," she said, almost in a whisper. Renato glanced at the employee, who looked surprised. The man's expression wavered between doubt and the certainty that he had done the right thing. "Is this your father?" the man asked, with a barely concealed tone of disdain. Renato didn't respond. His icy gaze pierced through the employee for long seconds, so intense that the man averted his eyes. "Let's go, Isabella," Renato said, his voice low yet firm. Isabella followed him without saying another word. As they passed through the glass door, Renato paused for a moment and cast one last look at the store, now distant and hostile. The shine of the displays meant nothing anymore. It was just a broken mirror reflecting the worst that money could buy. "Dad, why did he do that to me?" Isabella asked, her voice holding back tears, once they were outside the store. Renato looked at her, his eyes full of a pain he did not want to show. "Because he doesn't know who you are, sweetheart. But he will learn." "Naya, he." The cold, calculated tone in Renato's voice made Isabella furrow her brow, not understanding. "Let's go home. We'll talk later." Dear. As they walked to the car, Renato felt the weight of that humiliation dragging behind them like a shadow. He had allowed the scene to unfold to grasp something larger. It was not just an arrogant employee. There was something deep-rooted, invisible, corroding what he had built with so much effort. Renato sat in the driver's seat and turned on the car, but didn't leave right away. The silence between father and daughter was filled with a whirlwind of thoughts. Why didn't he act at that moment? Because he knew this went beyond a singular mistake. It was a deeper problem, a reflection of a system he had unknowingly helped to perpetuate. And if there was one thing Renato had learned over the years, it was that big problems required even bigger answers. He looked at Isabella, who was watching the rain trickle down the glass with a dejected face. In that moment, he made a decision. It wasn't enough to protect Isabella only at home, or within the walls of their family. He needed to protect the world around her. Renato smiled at his daughter, but it was a smile filled with a silent promise. Trust me, yes. What happened today is going to change a lot. Niandama. Isabella nodded, though she still didn't understand what her father meant. As the car slowly moved down the dark street, Renato was already formulating a plan in his mind. It wouldn't be simple, it wouldn't be quick, and it would undoubtedly cause a revolution that not everyone would be ready to face. But one thing was certain, no one would ever look at his daughter that way again. The rain was still drumming on the glass when Renato parked the car in the garage. Isabella was sleeping in the back seat, her serene face contrasting with the pain he felt. Every word spoken by the store employee echoed in his mind like a knife sinking slowly. He wouldn't be able to forget the humiliation in his daughter's eyes, or the contempt in that man's voice. Renato took a deep breath and faced his own reflection in the rearview mirror. They don't know who they're dealing with. Aye. His voice sounded cold and firm, almost a whisper to himself. There was a silent decision in his words, a relentless determination that few knew of. He carefully got out of the car and carried Isabella to her room. He placed her on the bed, adjusting the strands of hair that fell across her face. Even asleep, the girl's expression was melancholic. Renato felt a tightening in his chest. How could a world he had helped build treat his daughter that way? Before leaving the room, he glanced at the photo on the nightstand. Anna, his late wife, smiling while holding baby Isabella. Never let anything hurt her, she used to say. Renato had failed on that day, but he wouldn't let it happen again. The next morning, the sky was grey, as if the city itself reflected Renato's mood. He donned an impeccable suit, a dark shade almost intimidating, and left home early. He had a meeting scheduled with the top executives of his store chain, and this wouldn't just be another ordinary morning. Upon arriving at the company headquarters, the atmosphere felt quieter than usual. Employees averted their eyes upon seeing him, as if they felt the weight of his presence. Everyone knew that when Renato showed up unannounced, something big was about to happen. Renato entered the meeting room, where the managers were already waiting for him. The men and women at the table exchanged suspicious glances, as though they had been dragged into a trap from which they didn't know how to escape. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. Renato spoke with a calculated calm as he sat at the head of the table. His voice echoed in the room like a contained thunder. Yesterday, my daughter was humiliated in one of our stores. Silence settled in like an unbearable weight. Renato surveyed each face. Some frowned in confusion, while others looked visibly uncomfortable. She was treated like an intruder. By an employee of this company. My company. Nyanwan. His gaze fixed on Giulio, the regional director who always talked about high standards and customer selection. Giulio squirmed in his chair, tugging at the cuffs of his shirt as if he wanted to flee. Renato, I'm sorry. This is unfortunate. Of course. But it must have been a misunderstanding. Maybe that girl didn't. Nyana. Or say, down. Renato's stare was enough to silence him. That girl, Giulio, is my daughter, the only person in the world for whom I would give my life. Giulio's expression fell into panic, and the silence deepened even further. I want to. Sure, here is the translated text. Right now. What are the criteria for service that you have been teaching our employees? I want to understand where this sick culture of exclusion comes from. Renato, it's not quite like that, Giulio began. But Renato raised a hand, interrupting him. You have 48 hours to provide me with a complete report. Names, processes, and all the training given to date. I want to know how you're deciding who is worthy to enter my stores and who isn't. But, Mr. Yai. Renato, this could damage the brand's image. One of the managers hurried to intervene. Renato leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. The brand's image? You're worried about the image while a child was humiliated? If anyone here thinks that maintaining this disgusting culture of exclusion will save the brand, you are sorely mistaken. He stood up, calmly adjusting his suit, and stared down each person present. I will handle this personally. If you can't change this company's mentality, I assure you I will find someone who can. Renato left the room without looking back. The glass doors closed with a sharp sound, leaving the executive stunned. Back in the car, Renato made a call to Marcos, his trusted lawyer. Marcos, I want you to gather all the contracts and internal policies of the network. I need to know what I can change immediately. Also, prepare a statement for the press. I want to speak to the public soon. Renato, are you sure? This will cause a stir. Don't you think it would be better to resolve this discreetly? No. This will be resolved with all the necessary noise. That night, Renato invited Isabella to a special dinner. She entered the dining room shyly, still a bit downcast. Dad, why are we having dinner here today? Is it a special day? Renato smiled as he set her favorite dessert on the table. Yes, sweetie. Today marks the first day of a change you don't yet understand, but it's going to make the world a better place for you. Isabella frowned, confused, but smiled at her father's effort. You're acting strange, Dad. Renato chuckled softly. Strange? Perhaps. But sometimes being strange is exactly what we need to change things. As Isabella ate, he watched her face illuminated by the soft light in the room. He had made a decision, and there was no turning back. The next day, the news exploded on social media. CEO of Millionaire network exposes discrimination faced by his daughter at a luxury store. The image of Renato, serious and determined, with Isabella by his side, dominated the news portals. An official statement was released. No fortune or brand has value if the people who build it are not respected. I will not allow my company to perpetuate this culture of exclusion. There will be changes, even if the whole world revolts against me. The response was immediate. While some applauded Renato's stance, others, after being harshly criticized, the company's employees panicked. Longtime customers threatened boycotts, and the newspapers talked about the millionaire's audacity. But Renato didn't care. He had ignited a flame, and nothing, nor anyone, would extinguish it. The headlines exploded like bombs at dawn. Renato was on the cover of all the news portals, newspapers, and morning shows. Millionaire CEO exposes own company after daughter suffers racism. Heroism or hypocrisy? The decision that shook an empire. Polarization was inevitable. While many called him brave for exposing a systemic problem, others accused him of cheap marketing or airing dirty laundry in public. Some more traditional customers expressed outrage, while organized social groups saw in Renato a beacon of hope for change. At the company headquarters, the situation was chaotic. Phones rang incessantly, and employees, tense, struggled to contain the avalanche of emails and messages from angry clients. Giulio, the regional director whom Renato had confronted, stared at his computer screen, his face pale. As he read the furious comments about his management, "This is going to ruin everything," he muttered, sinking into his chair. But Renato seemed unfazed, sitting in his spacious office, with windows offering a panoramic view of the city. He calmly read the headlines and damage reports while sipping coffee. On the other side of the room, Marcos, the lawyer, was nearly hysterical. Renato, we need damage control now. The press is saying you've lost control of your own company. The shareholders will go crazy if sales drop. Nya. Renato looked at him with an almost cruel calmness. And since when is money worth more than the dignity of people? You know it's not about that, Marcos retorted, exasperated. It's about preserving what you've built. You're throwing away the empire that took years to build. Nice to see you. Renato set his cup down on the table, the sound of porcelain against wood echoing in the silent room. If what I built was at the cost of my daughter's humiliation, then it's worth nothing. None. Say. Marcos fell silent. He knew that when Renato made a decision, it was like moving a mountain. Prepare a new statement, Renato continued, his voice firm. I want all the stores to undergo an immediate audit. We will reevaluate the service, the training, everything. And, Marcos, I want the truth to come out. No matter the cost. Marcos stared at him for a few seconds, as if searching for something in his boss's gaze that suggested hesitation. He found nothing but determination. This is going to be a disaster. Then let it be a necessary disaster. That afternoon, Renato made a bold decision. He would visit the stores personally, with no warning. His plan was clear. Observe, unnoticed, and see what his eyes had ignored for years. Accompanied only by a discreet driver, Renato set out. The first store wearing simple clothes, a cap partially hiding his face. As he had anticipated, he went unnoticed. He walked through the stylish shelves, feeling like an outsider in his own empire. Soon enough, the familiar scene unfolded. A black woman, dressed in simple attire, entered the store with a hesitant look. Two saleswomen whispered to each other, casting quick, suspicious glances. Do you need help? Asked one of them, her tone so cold it sounded like a warning. I'm just looking, replied the woman, managing a nervous smile. The other saleswoman scoffed, turning to her colleague with an audible whisper. They never buy anything. Just a nuisance. Renato felt his anger rise like a wave. He clenched his fists but kept his composure. He needed this. He needed to see. He needed to hear. Only then could he uproot that culture. Before leaving the store, he jotted down the employees' names in a small notebook. It wasn't a list of firings, but a list of lessons to be taught. Meanwhile, at home, Isabella began to feel the weight of her father's actions. At school, the comments had spread like wildfire. So, your dad wants to save the world now, sneered a classmate, sarcasm dripping from his voice. He only did this because he's rich. I bet he wouldn't care if it was someone else. None. Isabella chose not to respond. She knew Renato was doing the right thing, but at the same time, she felt the world had turned against them. That night, when Renato returned, he found her sitting on the couch, hugging a pillow. How was your day, Isa? He asked, trying to sound casual. People are talking, Dad. They say you only did this because you're a millionaire. Renato sighed and sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Sometimes, when you do the right thing, people will try to bring you down. It's easier to criticize than to change. What if it doesn't work? He looked into her eyes, his voice filled with a firmness that came from deep within his heart. It will work. Because I am doing this for you. And for all the others who never had the chance to be heard. The next day, Renato called a press conference at the company headquarters. The auditorium was packed with journalists, cameras, and employees. The tension was almost palpable. Renato stepped onto the stage and scanned the crowd. He took a deep breath and began. For years, I built a company that, without my realizing it, became a symbol of exclusion. My daughter, an innocent child, was humiliated in a place that carries my name. This is not just a mistake. It's a reflection of something much larger, much sicker, that I chose to ignore. Now, the journalists murmured, cameras capturing his every move. Today, I take responsibility. Not just as a businessman, but as a father, as a human being. I am restructuring this company from the ground up. We will rebuild our values, our policies, and ensure that no person, from any color, class or gender should be treated as my daughter was treated. Nya. A deep silence filled the room. Then, a question was posed. Don't you think this is just a marketing ploy? Renato smiled, devoid of humor. If fighting for the dignity of my daughter and thousands of others is marketing, then perhaps the world needs more of it. Ha. The echo of Renato's words during the press conference still reverberated in the company's walls and the city streets. His decision to revamp the store chain had ignited a national debate. Activist groups praised his stance, while traditional customers and investors reacted as if they had been betrayed. A noble or suicidal move? The headlines blared. Has Renato Almeida gone mad? The downfall of the empire may be imminent. The internet was in turmoil. In the comments on social media, some messages lauded his decision as a display of bravery. Others, however, were vicious and rife with prejudice. But Renato, strengthened by his resolve, remained unfazed. On the contrary, he felt the battle was just beginning. At the company, the atmosphere was tenser than ever. Some employees began to resign. Others openly criticized the changes. This is absurd. We're losing our best clients. Giulio, the regional director, exclaimed in a heated meeting with other managers. He's destroying everything we've built. Who would want to shop at a store that accepts anyone? An older manager added, her words dripping with contempt. Renato entered the room amid the discussion, silent. The silence was immediate, as if the air had been sucked from the space. His piercing gaze scanned each face. You're speaking as if I asked for your opinion. Mens. His voice was cold and cutting. Some managers shifted uncomfortably. Renato leaned forward, hands pressed on the table. What's happening here goes beyond profits and customers. If you can't see that, maybe you should reconsider your place in my company. Renato, you're taking food from our table with these ideas, Giulio retorted, his face flushed with anger. Renato approached him slowly, coming to a stop beside him, almost too calm. No. The ones taking the bread are the arrogance and prejudice you allowed to fester. If you want a culprit, look in the mirror. Giulio fell silent. Renato turned to everyone. Whoever stands with me, prepare yourselves. If not, the door is right there. With that final line, he left the room. The sound of his firm footsteps echoed like hammer blows. Meanwhile, at home, Isabella watched the news on television. The mother of a school friend had forbidden her daughter from visiting. Your dad is making a lot of noise. My mom said this is dangerous, her friend had said, eyes downcast, avoiding her gaze. Isabella began to realize that the world around her was shifting. Undu wasn't changing as easily as her father's words had promised. When Renato got home that night, she was waiting for him in the living room, her face serious. Dad, are you fighting with everyone? Renato sat down beside her, sighed. Tired? It's not a fight, Isa. It's a struggle. But what if you lose? Renato looked her in the eye, his voice low, almost a whisper. If I lose, at least I'll have tried to change something. And you'll know it's always worth it to fight for what's right. She nodded, but there were still doubts in her eyes. Renato realized his struggle was not just to change the world. It was to show his daughter that the world could be changed. The next day, the situation took an even darker turn. Renato received an anonymous email. Stop this now. You're messing with important people. Maizan. Renato's heart raced. There was a threat in the lines, something veiled but real. He had no doubt that this message came from someone who wanted to take him down. Marcos, the lawyer, looked at the computer screen with a serious expression. Renato, This is getting dangerous. These are real threats. Whoever is behind this may be willing to do anything. Nina. Let them come. I'm not going to hide. Nan. Hanel. You have a daughter, Renato. Nie. The statement made Renato's blood run cold. Marcos noticed the impact and continued. Calmer now. You can't take that risk. Who's to say they won't come after her? Me. And us. The mere thought of someone hurting Isabella was enough to reignite the fury in Renato. He stood up, resolute. My daughter is the reason I'm doing this. If anyone dares to touch her, they'll see what her father is capable of. Mash. Days later, the tension reached a peak. A leaked video appeared on social media, showing Giulio, the regional director, in a private conversation with other managers. Renato has lost it. If he thinks he can take me down, he's mistaken. I know enough secrets to sink him and this whole company. Nah. The video spread like wildfire. Employees and public opinion became divided. There was more at stake than Renato had imagined. Giulio was clearly involved in something shady. But what? Renato called Marcos for a private meeting. I wanted a complete background check on Giulio. I need to know where his loyalties lie, and what dirt he's left behind. Nana. Marcos nodded. I'll find out. But be careful. He's cornered. And cornered men are dangerous. Meine. And seer. As the war raged on, Renato and Isabella had a rare moment of peace. Sitting in the garden at home, under the dark, starry sky, he watched his daughter play with a lantern, making shadows with her hands. Dad, I had a dream. What kind of dream? That one day everyone walks into the store without anyone frowning. That they smile at me like they do to other people. Nan. Renato looked at her, the lantern light illuminating her face. He smiled, even with his eyes filled of tears. This dream will become a reality. Isa. I promise. Nadia Shonda. She smiled, believing him. The leak of Giulio's video triggered a new wave of chaos. It was no longer just employees whispering or customers threatening boycotts. Now, the chain of stores had become the epicenter of a scandal involving corruption, secrets, and prejudice. The press was relentless, and shareholders, like vultures, circled Renato, waiting for his downfall. Inside the headquarters, the atmosphere was nearly unbearable. The hallways, once filled with confident and smiling employees, now felt like battlefields. Renato knew he was about to face something much bigger than mere resistance. Something deep and rotten that he had ignored for years. That morning, Marcos entered Renato's office with a dossier in hand and a serious expression. You need to see this. Renato took his eyes off the rapidly plummeting sales report and received the folder. Inside were a series of documents, suspicious bank transactions, and irregular concession contracts. Familiar names were involved, but one jumped out like an arrow to his eyes. Giulio. He was embezzling money. Renato's voice was a tone below a roar. Worse. Giulio and some other managers created a parallel scheme. Employees were encouraged to mistreat customers who didn't fit the store's profile. And why? To make room for certain exclusive partnerships. Some brands paid to have a selected audience in the stores. Leo. Misa. Renato slammed the dossier onto the table. The truth was more disgusting than he had imagined. The problem had never been just veiled prejudice. There was profit behind it. And Giulio, the man he had trusted for so many years, was profiting at the expense of humiliations. And there's more. Marcos hesitated before continuing. We found out who leaked the video. Nidiano was. Renato raised his eyes. Was it Giulio? No. It was a low-level employee. He knew you were investigating and wanted to expose Giulio before he harmed him. But now Giulio is cornered. Leo. He's threatening to reveal secrets that involve you. Renato was silent for a moment, his face tense, but his eyes burning. Secrets about me? Not exactly yours. Your wife's, Anna. Internis. Hearing Anna's name, Renato felt as if the air had been ripped from his lungs. For years, he had kept his wife's memory intact, a refuge from all that was worst in the world. He swallowed hard and looked at Marcos. What does he know? Marcos leaned in, speaking softly, as if fearing Giulio might hear even there. Apparently, Anna was aware of the scheme before she died. She found out something but never told you. Giulio thinks that if he can connect you to her past, he can bring you down. Nemoten, Dahain, and Ibanesiu, but Renato closed his eyes, feeling a whirlwind of emotions. Anna, Fantidi Direntazu, Undemounted Distahazu, Yetestori Wotu, Edaminastis. Why had she never told him? Why had she left that burden on his shoulders? Sure. Here's the translated text. Ah. What about Giulio? The audacity of that man to use his wife's name as a weapon was enough to reignite the flame of his fury. He wants a war? Then he will have one. Mayan. By the end of that afternoon, Renato decided to take action. He called an extraordinary meeting with the shareholders, directors, and managers of the network. The auditorium was full, but the silence was almost tomb-like. The tension was palpable. Renato stepped onto the stage, his expression serious, documents in hand. He glanced at Giulio, who sat in the front row, arms crossed and an ironic smile on his face. It was the smile of a man who believed he still had cards to play. We are here today because the truth has finally come to light. Renato began, his voice firm and audible in every corner of the auditorium. For years, our company thrived under a culture of elitism and exclusion. But this was no mistake. This was a system, carefully cultivated by individuals who think profit is worth more than human dignity. Main. Murmurs began to spread among the attendees. Giulio maintained his smile, but his gaze faltered for a moment. Renato continued. I investigated, and now I know who was behind this disgusting system. Ladies and gentlemen, here is the evidence that Giulio and other managers embezzled money, manipulated service policies, and humiliated clients solely to line their own pockets. Renato displayed a series of documents, graphs, and emails exchanged between Giulio and his allies on the screen. The auditorium erupted in murmurs and expressions of shock. Giulio stood up, furious. This is a lie. It's a setup. Renato slowly turned to him, his eyes sharp as knives. A lie? I have all the evidence right here, Giulio. And I can assure you that the police will have it soon. Nein, Disana. The security personnel moved in, ready to remove Giulio, but he pointed a trembling finger at Renato. And what will you do when they find out about Anna? She knew everything. She was part of this. There was an immediate silence. Anna's name rang out like thunder in the auditorium. All eyes turned to Renato, waiting for a reaction. Renato clenched his fists and took a deep breath. His heart was a storm, but his voice came out calm. Anna knew. Yes, she knew, and that's why she tried to change everything. But she ran out of time. He looked at Giulio with disdain. Do you think using my wife's name will save you? Everything you did alone. And now you will pay for it. Giulio was forcibly removed while swearing and shouting. Renato stood still on the stage, watching the scene. When everything finally quieted down, he turned to the auditorium. This company is changing, whether you like it or not. From today on, every store will have new service standards, new values. People will be treated with respect. And if anyone here still believes this isn't important, the door is open. I will hold it for you to leave myself. The auditorium. Renato remained silent. Some shareholders stood up and left, clearly dissatisfied. But most stayed. Renato knew that this battle wasn't won yet, but it was a start. That night, Renato returned home exhausted. Isabella was waiting for him in the living room, holding a drawing. He sat beside her and smiled. "What is this, Isa?" She showed him the drawing. It depicted a store with people of all colors, sizes, and styles, smiling. "It's the new store you talked about, Dad. The store where everyone is welcome." Renato felt his eyes welling up. He held her hand and kissed the top of her head. "That store is already becoming a reality, sweetheart." She smiled, innocently unaware of the weight of her father's words. As Renato hugged her, he knew that the storm had not yet passed. Giulio was out, but the forces against him had not been completely silenced. Renato looked out the window into the darkness. Something told him that the worst was yet to come. Hook. Giulio had been exposed, but his words about Anna still echoed. Renato managed to save his company from collapse, but powerful enemies still lurked in the shadows. Does he truly know everything about Anna's past? And who else is willing to take him down now? The answer would come soon. Would he be strong enough to protect Isabella and his wife's memory? The night was dark and quiet. In Renato's mansion, the only sound was the ticking of the clock in the living room. He couldn't sleep. Sitting in the armchair of his office, he stared at Anna's photo on the desk, lost among documents and reports. Giulio's words still echoed in his mind. Anna knew everything. "Yes? Why, Anna?" Renato whispered, almost expecting a reply from the silence. His wife had been the most honest person he had ever known. The idea that she might have been involved in that dirty scheme seemed absurd, but now he had to confront the final truth, even if it was painful. Renato opened a drawer and took out an old key, the same one Anna had left with a letter shortly before she died. A letter he had never had the courage to open. With trembling hands, he unfolded the yellowed paper. Anna's handwriting was there, delicate and firm as always. "Renato, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer by your side. I know you often believed I was keeping secrets, but now I need to tell you the truth. I discovered the scheme a few months ago. Giulio and other managers were tarnishing the company's name, discriminating against people, embezzling money, all hidden under a mask of profit and exclusivity. When I confronted Giulio, he threatened me. He said he would destroy our family if I told you. I stayed silent because I was scared. Scared of you losing everything you fought for. Scared you wouldn't handle it. But most of all, I was afraid something would happen to Isabella. Now, if you are reading this, it's because you are ready to face the truth. Lee. Remember, nothing we have built is worth more than the dignity of people. Fight for what is right, my love, and protect our daughter. She's our future." Renato let the paper drop into his lap, tears streaming down his face. Anna not only knew everything, but she was also the first to try to change things. She had carried the burden alone to protect him, to protect Isabella, and now he understood that the responsibility lay in his hands. "I promise, Anna, I will put an end to this." Mahas. The next morning, Renato walked into the company headquarters with a purpose evident in every firm step. There would be no more threats, no more lies, no more manipulations. He summoned the press, employees, and shareholders for one final collective meeting. The auditorium was packed, just like the last time. But now, the faces were different. Some tired, others still hostile, and many curious. Marcos stood beside him, concerned. "Are you sure this is the right thing, Renato? You'll lay everything bare. There's no turning back?" Renato smiled, but his gaze was serious. "The truth should never have a return, Marcos. It's now or never." He stepped onto the stage, facing the audience and the television cameras broadcasting live across the country. The murmur died down as he took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, my wife Anna believed that the truth was the only way to rebuild what has been destroyed. Today, I honor her memory." A photo of Anna was displayed on the screen, showcasing her warm smile and lively eyes. Renato took a deep breath and continued. In recent years, the culture of this company has been tainted by greed, exclusion, and prejudice. It's not just a matter of bad policies or problematic employees. It is a system that has failed. And that failure is mine too. Nyanan, Nides. The auditorium fell silent, shocked by the confession. Giulio, and others involved, used the brand I built to discriminate against people, humiliate clients, and profit at the expense of others' dignity. But that ends today. No more Sanya, and Teresa. Murmurs began to spread, but Renato raised his voice, overpowering the noise. From now on, the changes will not just be on paper. I'm distancing myself from anyone involved in this scheme, and all diverted profits will be returned through investments in inclusion and real opportunities. We will fund training, scholarships, and support those who have been wronged. This won't erase the past, but it's the first step towards rebuilding our future. Renato's words echoed like thunder. Some employees applauded timidly, but others stood up and left, making it clear they would not accept the change. Renato watched them leave without regret. He knew the road would be tough, but he was no longer alone. From the back of the auditorium, Isabella entered with Marcos. She looked at her father with eyes shining with pride. He smiled upon seeing her, feeling that, at last, he was honoring Anna's memory and protecting the daughter he loved so much. Dad, did you win? She asked as he stepped down from the stage. Renato hugged her and replied sincerely, Not yet, daughter. But we're on the right path. None. Weeks later, the storm was beginning to calm. The headlines had changed. Renato Almeida rebuilds his network with human values at the center. The empire that chose the truth. The stores gained a new identity, with inclusive policies and transparency in processes. Customers of all classes, colors, and ages began to enter with genuine smiles, greeted with dignity by employees trained not just to sell, but to respect. At school, Isabella was welcomed by her peers in a different way. Now, everyone knew who she was, not just the millionaire's daughter, but the girl who inspired a revolution. I told you the world could change, didn't I? Renato whispered to her as he dropped her off at the gate. You did, Dad. And I believe. Nyana. In the final scene, Renato walked through the store where it all began. Now, the aisles were full of life. A black woman was trying on an expensive dress, laughing with the saleswoman. On the other side, an older man in simple clothes was receiving help with a shy smile. Renato smiled, feeling the weight of years of neglect finally dissipate. He stopped in front of the window, where a mannequin displayed a small sign with a prominent phrase. The true value of a brand is the respect for every person who enters its doors. Anna's voice echoed in his memory. Remember who you are, Renato. He smiled, looking at Isabella's reflection in the glass, as she ran to hug him. We did it, Anna. We did it.